thank you folks for joining us. My name's Kent Hovind. I'm with Nick Soutter in Massachusetts. You say your degrees are in psychology and philosophy?
Yep.
Okay, and you're a writer, and you want to discuss the topic, is the theory of evolution true? And I hope Rhonda told you we want you to go first and take as long as you want. I don't care about the clock much, just so we get equal time. You want to go first and tell us why you think evolution is true?
Sure. I do have, so I actually have a presentation, so I'm going to try this screen share. And the other thing is the audio won't share on it. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take off the headset and put the mic right up to and you should be able to hear. We've tested this a couple times. It seems to have worked beautifully. And so let me give this a shot here. And you have been very gracious about the time, which I sincerely appreciate. So thank you. There we are.
Yeah, if evolution's true, everything ought to get better automatically. So the text is a problem.
All right. So I think you should be able to see that now.
Yes, sir. I see it fine.
All right. And let me start it and get the audio going. Thank you. Should be. It's about 12 minutes.
Okay.
Imagine you're talking to an atheist, and they say, "Do you eat shellfish?" You tell them you do, and they say, "Well, doesn't the Bible say that eating shellfish is an abomination?" Well, of course it does, but right off the bat you know that this atheist didn't learn the Bible from a minister. He doesn't know the first thing about the Bible. He doesn't understand the difference between Mosaic law and the New Covenant. Now, you can try to explain this to him all you'd like, but if he's already made up his mind that he's right and you're wrong, and that somehow he understands the Bible better than you do, he's not going to approach you with an open mind. He's going to say everything you say is a cop-out, and he's not going to give it a fair hearing. If someone really wants to understand the Bible, who should they go to? An atheist or a skeptic like Sam Harris or Richard Dawkins? People who say they understand it, but who never went to seminary and don't even believe it? No! The Bible is complex, with many messages which, improperly understood, could lead one to a false understanding of God's Word. If you want to understand the Bible, you go to a minister or theologian, someone who believes it, someone who understands the big picture and can explain it in context. Evolution is very much the same thing. It's complex. It isn't easily understood. If you want to learn what evolution truly claims, you shouldn't go to Ken Ham or to a creationist, but to an evolutionary biologist, someone who has dedicated their life to understanding it and who believes it. Now, you don't have to believe what they tell you, but at least you know you'll be getting the correct information from the horse's mouth. Even other scientists, like physicists or engineers, usually aren't qualified to give in-depth answers about evolution. It simply isn't their field. Evolution is not simply a fact. It's a theory. You may think that a theory is what you see on television, a cop who says that he has a theory of the crime, or a lawyer who has a theory of the case. But the word theory actually means something extraordinarily different in science. In science, theories are much bigger than laws. They're much bigger than facts, and they are in fact the highest form of knowledge one can have. Every scientist dreams of making a theory. That's the end goal, but only a very few rare geniuses ever succeed in doing it. Gravity is just a theory, but nobody would say it's not true or that it's just a guess. Atomic theory powers our country and destroyed Hiroshima and Nagasaki. If you think germ theory is just a theory, stop washing your hands and tell your doctor he doesn't need to use sterile equipment before surgery. The theory of relativity is so powerful it allowed us to land a man on the moon and bring him back alive again in one piece. But theories aren't simple things. They're complex and can only be understood as a whole. When viewed as individual little parts, it looks silly, and just like many pieces of the Bible. You need context to understand the full picture. And, like the Bible, you're not going to grasp it in 5 or 10 minutes. If you've ever dismissed evolution as just a theory, or asked, if evolution is real, why are there still monkeys, or argued that, hey, it doesn't show how life started, or pointed out that there are no transitional fossils, or suggested that an elephant can come from an ear of corn, you're making statements just as ignorant as the atheist who says, well, if God loves us, why does he send people to hell? In fact, all fossils are transitional fossils. Evolution does not try to explain how life started, and most importantly, evolution, in fact, does not allow for one kind of animal to become another kind of animal. When a biologist says a different kind of animal, what they really mean is just a new species, but all species are always the same kind. No animal has become a different kind of animal, and if one ever did, evolution would be dead as a theory. Corn will always produce other kinds of corn, and elephants always will produce another kind of elephant. And if none of this makes sense to you, if you think this is all contrary to what you understand about evolution, then you have been grossly misinformed. The idea of evolution has been around since the ancient Greeks. They noticed that they could breed animals and select for strength, stamina, or speed, depending on what they needed. Using what they learned, we've invented entirely new species of crops like wheat and corn, neither of which exist in nature. The process of making these things is called artificial selection. When a species reproduces, there are tiny random changes in traits. We select the traits that are desirable, breed those, while ignoring the ones we don't want. The shorter the life cycle of the plant or animal, the faster we can do this. With crops, we can see significant changes quite quickly. With animals, it takes a lot longer. It occurred to the Greeks that perhaps all living things evolve, and that one species can turn into another over time. The problem is that since all these traits were random, it won't work without something guiding the process of selecting the more desirable traits over the less desirable ones. This was a problem that went unsolved until a man by the name of Charles Darwin made a startling discovery. He realized that there was in fact a natural process for selecting these traits. He called this natural selection. Darwin began mapping species, figuring out their origin, and trying to establish where they came from, based on how they interacted in the environment. He was so successful at this, he was able to predict new species that nobody had ever seen before. The evolution of the star orchid, he realized, couldn't have occurred unless there was a moth with a 2-foot tongue flying around somewhere. He was laughed out of the scientific community for that claim, and yet shortly after his death, that moth was actually found. But he also discovered that the further back in time he went, the more these ancestors started to look a lot like each other. He realized that by going back far enough, species all came from a common ancestor. Now, Darwin was a Christian, and this was not the answer he was looking for. Indeed, this threw him into a crisis of faith. It put him at odds with his friends, his family, his community, to say nothing of the fact that scientists thought it was ludicrous. But he continued and pretty soon created a rudimentary tree of life. Now, we use the tree of life to map which species came from where and how every species is related to each other. It looks complicated, but really it's no different from a family tree. We as species have ancestors, we have cousins, we have distant cousins, and just like your family tree, where no member can jump from one branch to another, no kind of species can actually jump from one kind or one branch to another kind. Now, people argue that because there are gaps in our knowledge, that proves it's not true. But gaps don't disprove anything. There are gaps in the Bible. The Bible doesn't record every reign of every king. It doesn't record the ancestry of absolutely every person from Adam to Paul. Jesus, whose life and death is literally the topic of the New Testament, and the Bible doesn't even record when he was born, when he died, or where he was buried. Now, does that mean that Jesus wasn't real? Does it mean the crucifixion wasn't real? Of course not. Gaps in our knowledge doesn't disprove evolution. If you want to disprove evolution, you have to find predictions that it makes that in fact turns out to be false. Any one genuine contradiction is enough to bring the entire system down. If you find a kangaroo fossil in the wrong sedimentary layer or dated to the wrong time, it's over. Find an amphibian fossil that's older than the oldest fish fossil, and evolution is dead and buried. Find a mammal that has feathers anywhere in the world, and evolution is gone. But after millions of species cataloged, after trillions of fossils found, not one has contradicted the theory as we understand it. What's more, the theory of evolution explains biological mysteries that have gone unanswered for millennia. The laryngeal nerve is a nerve that connects your voice box to your brain. Your voice box is only about 3 inches away from the base of your skull, but rather than go directly there, this nerve actually goes in the wrong direction, all the way down to your heart, under the aorta, and back up again to your brain, traveling roughly 2 feet to hit a target that's 3 inches away. All mammals have this nerve, and in a giraffe it's over 12 feet long. The vagus nerve does the same thing, and should go straight from your spinal cord to your diaphragm, but instead heads up from your lungs to the base of the skull. This is one of the reasons you get the hiccups, is because this nerve is not intelligently designed. Many of the nerves in your body, in fact, take indirect routes to where they're trying to get to. But if you go back through our evolution, what you'll see is that the nerves start getting closer and closer, and the routes become far more direct. Look at our earliest amphibian ancestors, and you'll realize that all the nerves take direct routes. It's only after that amphibian starts to grow from a 4-legged animal to a 2-legged animal and walk upright that these nerves get dragged throughout the entire body to accommodate these changes as they're being made. We have tailbones. Whales have hip bones and a ball and socket joint. Again, if you understand the evolution of whales, you'll see both why they have these bones and why they've atrophied so much over time. Evolution has been used to successfully predict new species, explain mysteries we previously didn't understand, taught us how to combat disease, and even allowed us to create new organisms to fit specific needs. It's confirmed by multiple independent and unrelated fields of science, from embryology to archaeology to comparative anatomy, and been verified by independent scientists in every industrialized country in the world. Evolution had already been proven when, in 1953, we discovered DNA. What would the DNA show us? Would it disprove the theory or undermine it in some way? Well, once we sequenced the DNA, we found that the genetic material produced another tree of life. It's a second map produced completely independently in a completely unrelated field that reached all of the same conclusions. Only this one was far more detailed and allowed us to fill in many of the gaps that we hadn't understood before. Now, imagine please for a moment a rainbow. If I were to ask you how many colors are in that rainbow, you might say 7. But in reality, there's an infinite number of colors in a rainbow. For convenience, we say 7, but that rainbow actually contains every color imaginable. And while each color is different, each color also blends into the other colors. Red becomes orange, becomes yellow, becomes green, becomes blue, becomes indigo, becomes violet. If you look at the entire rainbow, red ultimately transitions to violet. And if I ask you to point to the place where red officially becomes orange, you can't do it. It's a progression. There's no one point where you can say that before this point it's red and after this point it's orange. Where does orange become yellow? Where does yellow become green? You can't do it. You can't point to a single discrete spot where these things happen. The same is true for evolution. Sure, we declare a species to start here or end there, but there's always wiggle room either way, and it's usually impossible to point to a definitive beginning or end of any particular species. No one generation is completely incompatible with its recent ancestors, but enough time passes and they drift further and further into a new species. All evolution is microevolution, just tiny changes which accrue over time, and when a sufficient number of these changes have occurred, we declare that we have witnessed macroevolution. But that's just a word. It's a convenient way of defining stages of the evolutionary process. If you believe in microevolution, that's the ballgame. Macroevolution is simply an arbitrary distinction we use for classification. To ask an evolutionist to point to the precise point where an ape became a man is a false argument. It's a straw man. There is no precise point. There never has been. Nobody ever argued there would be, and that's simply not how evolution works. These skulls here are a progression of human evolution, and while there is definitely significant change over time, and the first generation is completely incompatible with the last generation, there is no definitive point at which one can say a new species occurred. What's more, if you look at the tree of life, you'll see that there is never an instance where one kind of species has actually become another kind of species. That can't happen. It doesn't work that way. An ear of corn simply cannot turn into an elephant. No members of one branch of the tree can jump to another branch of the tree. Think about Abraham. Abraham and Sarah had many descendants. The children of these descendants will always be descendants of Abraham and Sarah. So will their children, and so on and so forth, no matter who they marry or what new branches are created on their family tree. Likewise, the descendants of Abraham and Hagar will also always be descendants of Abraham and Hagar. And while all of these ancestors share a common ancestry with Abraham, some are related to Hagar and others are related to Sarah. At no point can a descendant of Sarah give birth to a descendant of Hagar. It can't happen. The tree of life works the exact same way. Any descendants of corn will always be a kind of corn. You can get new species of corn and maybe get something that looks completely different, but it will always be a kind of corn. Anyone who says that an ear of corn can turn into a whale or a tomato doesn't understand how evolution works or is deliberately strawmanning it to make it look silly. This is us on the tree of life. No matter how much we evolve, no matter how much we change, no human being will ever produce an animal that is not a kind of human being. Beings came from apes. Therefore, we are also a kind of ape. Apes are a kind of primate, so we are primates too. All primates are a kind of mammal. This makes us a kind of mammal. All mammals are a kind of animal, so we are also a kind of animal, and our descendants will also be animals, and no matter how much we evolve or how much time you put into it, none of them will ever be a plant or a fish. And since all animals are eukaryotes, we are also eukaryotes. Evolution has been proven true time and time and time again. It's made predictions. It's explained holdovers like the tailbone, the laryngeal nerve, and hip bones in aquatic mammals like whales. And in fact, the vast majority of Christians believe it. Catholics, Protestants, Orthodox, they all accept evolution as true and that it doesn't contradict the Bible. That in fact, it's the means by which God works to make us the way we are today. Dr. Robert Carter in the Journal of Creation actually showed how mutations might not even be random, but instead pre-encoded by God into our DNA. There's no reason this has to contradict anyone's faith. The question is, does the evidence support it? The evidence for evolution is staggering across multiple independent and unrelated fields of research and concords with any new evidence we find. And with a near infinite number of defeaters that would destroy the theory, not one has been shown to work. Instead, with every new discovery, the tree of life becomes clearer, more precise, and better understood. And if you want to understand it, truly understand it, and learn for yourself whether or not it's true, don't talk to a creationist, don't talk to a physicist, talk to an expert, learn directly from the horse's mouth, and see why so many of your Christian brothers and sisters believe it and still love and hold their Bible dear. Thank you.
All right. I guess it's my turn. Well, thank you, Nick. I think we can fix all that. Not a problem. I don't go back word by word on some of that. Let me give you my introduction here, and then you can take it from there. The question to be debated tonight is the theory of evolution true? Well, we need to define a couple of words in all of this, like the word true. In accordance with fact or reality. Is it a fact, is it reality that all life forms came from a single cell creature? My contention is no, not at all, not true, okay? Now, the Merriam-Webster, being in accordance with the actual state of affairs is the definition of true. Comfortable, conformable to an essential reality, fully realized or fulfilled. Is it true? How about your dictionary? The definition of true is being loyal. That's a different kind of true. He's true blue or something. Something that is real, factually correct, accurate, or provable. Is it provable that humans and whales and amoebas have a common ancestor? I would say absolutely not. You're welcome to believe that. It's a faith. It's not. It cannot have the definition of true. Truth would be the opposite of lies. Pilate, like most politicians, did not know what truth was. What is truth? There probably aren't too many politicians even today that understand that one. But Philippians, we're told, finally, brethren, whatsoever things are true, to think on these things. So the topic of the debate tonight, as I understand it, is the theory of evolution true? Well, theory, a supposition or a system of ideas intended to explain something. Certainly, evolution is a theory. It's a supposition. It's a system of ideas that intends to explain why we have such a great diversity of life on Earth, especially one based on general principles independent of the thing to be explained, like Darwin's theory of evolution, hypothesis, thesis, conjecture, supposition, etc. Okay. The textbooks teach evolution as if it is true, and you don't even think about questioning it. They start with that assumption. That's like me asking students to explain, why are elephants orange? That's a false assumption to start with. They're not orange, okay? Evolution is the process of change in all life forms over generations. This is pretty much what you said, Nick. And evolutionary biology is the study of how evolution occurs. Biological populations evolve through genetic changes that correspond to changes in the organism's observable traits. Just what you said. Darwinism is the theory of biological evolution developed by the English naturalist Charles Darwin. How he got to be called a naturalist, I don't know. He was a theologian. You should ask real scientist, not Charles Darwin, who was a theologian by your definition there, Nick. What is the main theory of evolution? Natural selection. The theory of evolution by natural selection, first formulated in Darwin's book On the Origin of Species, that's not the whole title, by the way, in 1859, is the process by which organisms change over time as a result of changes in heritable, physical, or behavioral traits. From Quora.com, downloaded about an hour ago, they show that four-legged creatures slowly evolved into the whale. And you would say, I'm sure, Nick, that some of the evidence for this is the whale still retains hip bones. You're sadly mistaken on that. Those are not hip bones, but we'll get into that later on. My video number 4, I covered that in great detail. It lies in the textbooks, okay? The 4 basic premises of Darwin's theory. The world's animal and plant communities are dynamic, not static. I think I would agree with that, only I think there are limits to how dynamic they can be. They change over time with new forms originating and others becoming extinct. I agree with that depending on what you mean by new forms, okay? Bigger dogs, littler dogs, but it's still always going to be a dog. Number 2, the evolutionary process is gradual and continuous. New species arise through slow and steady environmental changes. I defy anybody, well, we better define the word species here, but I would use the word kind. Nobody's ever seen any new kind arise slowly or quickly. This is dreaming. This is fairy tale stuff. This is not science. This is not true. Number 3, all organisms descended from an original and common ancestor. Really? All organisms. So the whale and the mosquito have a common ancestor. This is what the theory teaches. Is it true that a whale and a mosquito have a common ancestor? Over time, the process of natural selection has created different species, each specifically adapted to its ecological niche. Number 4 here. Natural selection not only causes changes within populations during changing environmental conditions, but also acts to maintain the status quo under relatively constant environmental conditions. Probably could agree with that. Textbooks like Encyclopedia Britannica would show that all life forms slowly evolved from, billions of years ago, came up to what we have today. University California in Berkeley shows that the humans and the whales have a common ancestor with the dinosaurs and the frogs and the tuna and the sharks, if you go back far enough. This is what the theory teaches. Is this true? Is it true that chimpanzees and perch have a common ancestor? That's your job to prove that. Is it true that humans and insects have a common ancestor? These are the kind of things kids face in school every day. Evolution, all in the family. The fish is my 118 millionth cousin, my 280,000th cousin to the chimpanzee. The frog is talking here, I'm sure. My 21 millionth cousin. Well, you can believe all that if you want, but is it true? Here's a family tree showing humans and whales and horses and cows, all related to tuna and snails and squid and ferns and all the plants and all the amoebas, everything back to a common ancestor. It's very easy, Nick, to draw lines on paper and claim that that is evidence or that that is somehow supported by evidence, but I just simply don't buy that. Is it true that humans and zebras have a common ancestor? Is it true that humans and pine trees have a common ancestor? This drawing says it does. It says they are. They draw lines on paper as if it is true. I think it's your obligation, if you want me to be forced to pay for your religion to be taught in all the schools, it's your job to prove it. Okay, you say it's true. Common descent describes how, in evolutionary biology, a group of organisms shares a more recent common ancestor. There is massive evidence of common descent of all life on Earth from the last universal common ancestor. And they have the last universal common ancestor as an amoeba, slowly becoming all the humans and the plants and everything else. You can download Tree of Life and just Google it, and there are probably tens of millions of responses to that showing all these trees of life. Is it true? Sorry. Textbooks certainly present it like it's true and try to give evidence for it, like this one, evidence of evolution from fossils, something that you mentioned, Nick. I've pointed out hundreds of times, no fossil could possibly count as evidence for evolution. When you find a fossil in the ground, all you know is it died. All you can prove is it died. You cannot prove it had any children. You certainly cannot prove it had children that were different than itself. No animal today produces children that are different than themselves. Why would we think the ones that are found as fossils could do it? Evidence from structure. This is your argument from the whale's pelvis, supposedly. Is there structure that indicates evolution? Is there evidence from molecular biology? Or how do you tell the age of fossils? Is there evidence from development? This is the argument from the embryos, proven wrong in 1874, still being taught. And then they talk about natural selection. Mutation, migration, genetic drift, and natural selection are mechanisms of change. The importance of genetic variation, the random nature of genetic drift, and the effects of a reduction in genetic variation. How variation, differential reproduction, and heredity result in evolution by natural selection. It goes on, the article does. In other words, this is supposedly how it's supposed to work. Natural selection selects the best one. What are the four mechanisms of evolution? Allele frequencies in a population may change due to four fundamental forces of evolution: natural selection, genetic drift, mutations, gene flow. The four fundamental forces of evolution. Well, natural selection can only select. I said, I want you to go to the screwdriver drawer where all of our screwdrivers are and select all the hammers. There aren't any hammers to select from in the screwdriver drawer, okay? So you can't select hammers out of the screwdriver drawer. Natural selection can only select what's already available in the genetic code. It is not in the genetic code of worms to have wings and fly. So how are we going to get a worm to develop into a bird through natural selection? Because birds have wings and worms don't. What about genetic drift? Can the gene code drift off enough to turn a worm into a bird or make it fly? I would say no, that's not true. Could a mutation cause that? If a worm was mutating slowly toward becoming a bird, it would take trillions of mutations, first of all, and each one would have to have the opposite sex mutate at the same time in the same area. And all observed mutations are harmful, fatal, or neutral. They do nothing. I would defy anybody, including you, Nick, to show me a real beneficial mutation that added genetic material. And if it did indeed if you had a beneficial mutation that added new genetic material, All the rest of them have to die or this doesn't work because they're going to get blended back into the population. This is Adolf Hitler 101. We find the superior race and eliminate the inferiors. It's actually best if the inferiors die for the evolution theory. Gene flow, sure. Genes flow. You have genes from your parents and grandparents and great-grandparents. They've been flowing for generations, and you're still human, and so were they, far back as you want to go. I find it very interesting that atheists argue against design using arguments that they designed. Like you designed your PowerPoint presentation to teach how things happen by chance. Think about that, Nick, for a few minutes, okay? If a protozoa, this textbook says, turns into the biology teacher over, if it happened quickly, we would all know it's a fairy tale. You know, you kiss a frog, it turns to a prince. Sort of, you know. Okay, I forgot, sorry. Okay, sort of keeping track of time. Just a few more minutes here. If we say a frog turns to a prince quickly, that's obviously a fairy tale. But somehow, if the protozoa turns to a biology teacher slowly, that's modern science. I think that's ridiculous. Satan is a liar. The Bible says one day the great dragon will be cast out, the old serpent called the devil and Satan. He deceiveth the whole world. I think many millions of people, including you, Nick, have been deceived by this silly idea that we all evolved from a common ancestor. Jesus said to the crowd, ye are of your father the devil. There's no truth in him. When he speaketh a lie, speaketh of his own. He's a liar and the father of it. All the lies come from the devil, according to the Bible. And I think it's a lie to teach kids that you are related to a worm and an amoeba, which came from a rock, which came from nothing that exploded. I think that's a lie. The Bible says in the last days there will be scoffers walking after their own lust and say, where's the promise of his coming? Since the fathers fell asleep, all things continue as they were. This is exactly what you're teaching, Nick. The way things are happening now is the way they've always been happening. Slow, gradual changes. It was predicted 2,000 years ago that people in the last days would come and teach this. This is not true. For this, they willingly are ignorant of. They are deliberately stupid about three things. By the word of God, the heavens were of old. God, by his word, he spoke everything into existence. And the earth standing out of the water and in the water. I covered that in my video number 2. And the second thing they're ignorant of is the flood. There was a worldwide flood that deposited nearly all the fossils we find in the whole planet, all done in 1 year. Third thing they're ignorant of is the coming judgment. There's a judgment coming. And Nick, I'm worried for you. If your position that you hold to now is what you always hold to, I think you're going to be in trouble when you stand before the Creator, who not only created you, but wrote a book and told you how he did it. So is the theory of evolution true? My contention is absolutely no, not true. If I find an arrowhead on the ground, I know automatically somebody designed this. I may not know who, I may not know where, but I know somebody designed it. They say there's evidence for evolution. There are different kinds of evidence. We don't have time, I'll stop right there. We can look at all the various different types of evidence. I would like to see some real scientific evidence for evolution. I would hold that there is none. Nobody has ever seen, nobody's been ever able to make any animal or plant into a totally new kind of plant or animal. They can't even make it happen, let alone see it happen. So, Nick, I'd like to know what your thoughts are. If I have time, I have a list of things that you said that I'd like to. You said no animal has ever become another kind of animal. How can you possibly say that, Nick? You believe they did. You believe the amoeba became a whale. That's a different kind of animal. You believe the amoeba became a mosquito. You believe this early ancestor became everything. How can you possibly say with a straight face that you believe no animal has ever become another kind of animal?
Well, I mentioned.
Yeah, I'd like to hear that. How can you say that? Go ahead.
Time to unmute himself.
Yeah, you have to unmute, Nick.
Thank you about oh no, I would no, I'd kind of like to go in order, but I think that's a good question. I do have a quick question. You said we're in the end times. Just out of curiosity, about when did that start? If that's something that can be known, I'm just curious.
When did the end times start?
Well, yeah. When did we sort of start? If there's a general, I mean, did it start 100 years ago, 16 years? I'm just curious. I don't know.
I don't know. Peter said it 2,000 years ago that in the end times it would happen. It started happening in the last couple hundred years where they started denying the creation, the flood, and the coming judgment. So I suppose maybe about the time of Darwin. Let's pick a date and say mid-1800s it started.
All right. Oh, thank you. All right. So to answer, and then I would like to try to get in order, but to answer that question, because I think that's a very important one. I do think there's something called affirming the consequent, which is a logical fallacy, and I think it gets made a lot in this regard. It absolutely, evolution, and this is again why I would like to have people talk to evolutionary biologists to understand the distinction, because this is, at no time does one species turn into another one. We all inherit our older species. Now, for example, I am, let's assume for a second, and I want to try to use some of the biblical examples. Let's assume that I am of the Abrahamic line, if you go back far enough. Now, I would still be part of the line of, let's say, Abraham and Sarah. Now, my parents were suitors. So I have also become a suitor. And if I marry into another family, they may change and also add to that family and add to that family. And you have that tree right up there right now. People may not be able to see it, but if you look at the trees, and this is something I tried to explain in my opening, something's always, you have the so-called change is really just a refinement into something else. So a worm cannot become a bird. It's already past that stage. A bird is somewhere completely different on that tree, just in the same way that a descendant of Abraham and Hagar could not be born into the Abraham and Sarah line. It cannot be done. They've already passed that stage. They can create new families, but they've already passed that stage in the family tree. Same thing here. So everything started from very simple single-celled organisms that branched out, that huge level of diversity, and then created new life, and everything's descended from those lines. So if you start with the eukaryotes, everything that came from a eukaryote is still a eukaryote, but eukaryotes branched out and created mammals, and animals, various different kinds of animals, so on and so forth. But once you're a worm, you can still be refined as a worm, but you're always going to stay a worm. A worm will never become a bird. That's going backwards on the evolution. That ship's already sailed. That's not going to happen. So I think it's a misunderstanding of evolution to think that one species will become another. We have inherited all of our ancestor species, and then there are cousins and so on and so forth, as you pointed out, which I would agree with. Now, you were asking for evidence of evolution, and I do think that the sort of holdovers are one example. There's the evolution, because it's a theory, and I would define true as something can be said to be true if it is in accordance with measurable reality. And that's the way I think science normally looks at it. Now, the theory of evolution has a great many different independent fields that contribute to it. But I would like to, at a minimum, start, and you mentioned bones, you mentioned archaeology, all sorts of things that I think are absolutely worth talking about. But I'd like to start with, just so we do these in order, the sort of holdovers in our own anatomy. Or in anatomy of other species, that you sit there and you say, okay, so why do whales have hip bones and a ball and socket joint? Now, if they were just designed that way, it would seem, I mean, in most cases, these don't seem to serve any purpose, but if you understand where the whale came from, and if you watch in the sedimentary layer as those bones get smaller and smaller and smaller, and in some cases fuse, you can watch the atrophy. The atrophy is much less in the larger whales, but it still happens. And this is a good example of a holdover from when they were, in fact, four-legged animals. And I think I had something else I was going to say, but I lost my train of thought, so I'll let you respond to that.
All right. Well, that's a good one to start. I'm trying to find the particular slides. I show pictures. I had an actual whale hip bone, as you're talking about, in the museum. It's now still in Pensacola, Florida, but this is a very common, I think every debate I've been in where they talk about, evidence for evolution, they bring up this one about the whale having hip bone. This is simply not true. I'll show you here if I can find it. Those bones, if you study whale anatomy, those bones are part of the whale's reproductive system. They cannot make baby whales without those special bones and special muscles to control their reproductive organs. They have to mate underwater in the dark with no hands, and they can't talk and say, scoot over, honey. So this is absolutely silly to believe that the whale has a vestigial pelvis or anything else, and another ball and socket. if there's a bone with muscles attached to it that's able to maneuver around for the obvious function of making more baby whales, I think that's evidence of design. I think the whales probably appreciated being able to do that. It's just simply not true. Plus, even then, even if it were true, though, Nick, that would be an example of losing something, not gaining something. So you're saying it had legs and it lost them to become a whale. Would you please, first of all, that example is not true, but show me an example where something has gained something. Because to go from a worm to anything non-worm, and they do show the amoebas, the protista, as the ancestor of all life forms. That's what the chart shows. So where is the evidence of any animal or plant gaining some new information, some new feature, some new structure? The hip bone would be the exact opposite of what you need as evidence. So give me your best one you know of for gaining something, please.
All right. So to handle those in order, because I think that's a very fair question. By the way, to refute one thing you said, my wife is utterly convinced that I came from a head of cabbage. So at a minimum there, I would think she would agree that it's been proven. But that's a whole nother point.
Okay.
Now, so you're right, I would have to demonstrate, or evolution would have to demonstrate something added. So let's discuss that in a second. But this is an example of why I think it is important to talk to. So I had mentioned earlier, there are a lot of passages in the Bible that you would not understand if you didn't speak to someone who was well-versed in the Bible, and that would come across as very different than intended and I've got a couple of those. I don't have them handy, but I can get them in a minute. But ones where you really need to talk to a minister. And I have atheist friends who sit there and say, oh my God, Nick, did you see this in the Bible where Moses says that you should go out and rape women? And I'm sitting there going, look, the Bible's been around for 2,000 years. If you think you found a defeater to it just by browsing through, maybe you should take a step back and talk to someone who at least believes it. Don't talk to an atheist. Talk to someone who believes it. Now, with the biology of the whale, I believe what you're referring to when you talk about the muscles in the reproductive system, there is actually only one study that I'm aware of that refers to that. It is this study right here, Sexual Selection targets cetacean pelvic bones. And this is the study. Now, there are a couple of interesting things about this study. First of all, one of the things that this study notices is that there are females that have those same bones. So it's not just the males. And it is true that it is used to anchor the male reproductive system, but only in the larger whales, which is something that I mentioned earlier, only in the larger whales. In the smaller species, those muscles don't exist. Also, those muscles are tied to the pelvic bone and not to the ball and socket joint, which in fact does exist. And what I will show you here is, this is a picture of that ball and socket joint. And I actually had this picture in my presentation. And first of all, below you will find a code. That is what museum it is stored in. That one was in the presentation, as was a couple of other ones. These are all actually female bones. And that study, which does find what you were saying about the male reproductive system, actually says that proves evolution for a number of reasons. First of all, again, what it has done is it has slowed the atrophy of those bones in the males that have it. Again, only a select number of species. The females also have those bones, and it's not just whales, it is actually porpoises, it is dolphins, male, female, all alike. And if you speak to any biologist anywhere in the world, they will tell you that the females have those bones. Now, one of the things I did was, in case this came up, I did speak to a biologist. His name is David Taylor, and he actually does necropsies on whales, including the females, and he has seen those muscles, and he's seen whales without those muscles. He is actually able to identify, in many species, the difference between a male hip bone and the female hip bone, and again, the ball and socket joint, which according to that study is not tied to this system and is still part of one of those evolutionary holdovers. David Taylor works at the Woods Hole Oceanographic Institute, and he has on his website, which I will make available, actual necropsies on the females where you can see the mammary gland and you can see those bones that do not serve any purpose, and he has actually pulled them out. And he has actually been gracious enough to invite you and I both to an autopsy of a female whale if we would like to see those bones and confirm that they are in the female and that they are not part of the reproductive system. my hope is that addresses, and again, all you have to do is ask any biologist and they will tell you that yes, that study did find that in some males it serves that purpose, but it's only the larger species. That does not address a couple of other issues that you had, which I would like to address, but I don't want to talk forever, so I'd like to give you a chance to respond if.
Yeah, Steve, let me on. Okay. I have, in our museum, we have replicas, castings of those bones. And you are correct, the male and female are different. The male, as you may know, nobody's ever seen whales meeting because they don't do it so deep in the ocean. It's a big mystery, but they mount the female from behind. She's got a huge tail in the way. She has to maneuver her reproductive organs also. And I would defy this guy at Woods Hole or any place else to prove that they don't use them. Why would they have them if they don't use them? Why would the body keep reproducing something over and over? Why would it be in the genetic code to make a bone they don't use?
It wouldn't. I think that's kind of the point.
Well, and I think you'll find that, as you mentioned, whales are, the textbooks say whales have them. They say they have hind limb bones that have no function. This is what kids are being taught. This is just a lie. With this book in my library here, just imagine whales walking around. These are the bones they're talking about from the Los Angeles Museum of Natural History, right there. And the different types of whales have different shaped bones, okay, depending upon the type of whale it is. These are the ones found in a killer whale, as opposed to, what was this one? I don't remember what this particular whale was in the museum hanging from the ceiling there. But the bones have different shapes because the whales are different. We have different shaped skulls on people too. There's the one that I have the casting of here from a pilot whale. National Pornographic shows the leftover whale on a dolphin, so the leftover bones on a dolphin skeleton. The whale's pelvis. Here's one of the actual bones we have down in Pensacola. It has blood supply, it has nerve supply. It's not useless, it's being used. The male and female reproductive systems are very different. The male's reproductive organ is 15 feet long. He's got to maneuver this underwater in the dark with no arms without being able to talk and hit the target and make baby whales. So this is, I think, somebody has no understanding of biology if they think those bones serve no function. They certainly do. But again, you're missing the entire point that this example you're giving is an example of losing, not gaining. All the textbooks teach it because that's the best one they've got. I say, guys, this is the opposite of what you need. You need trillions of examples of something gaining a new feature, a new structure, new information. To go from an amoeba to a whale, you have to gain a whole lot of stuff. Where is the evidence of any creature gaining something? Go ahead.
All right. Well, actually, I'll get to Dr. Carter in a second on gains because he's an interesting one. But so let's start with a couple examples of gains because I do think that is a fair point. Actually, just to quickly. So I have seen that image also does exist in this study. So that is precisely from this study. And once again, they confirm what you said, but only in the larger ones. And the study says that this study reaffirms evolution and says that their findings, and they explain why, and I will make the study available on my website, but explicitly states that that reproductive system does not exist in the smaller whales or dolphins. As to gaining new functions, there's a lot of times when that's actually been done. One of the interesting ones, and I had said this in my opening before too, it's difficult to find those in mammals and larger animals because of the life cycle. It's smaller to find. It's easier to find it in smaller ones. One of the interesting ones is goat's beard, which was introduced into the United States. It is a kind of wildflower, and it was introduced into the United States from Europe shortly after the turn of the century. Within a few decades, their population expanded, and they began to encounter one another in the American West. Whenever mixed populations occurred, the species interbred, producing a sterile hybrid offspring. Then in the late 40s, two new species of goat's beard appeared near Pullman, Washington. Although the new species were similar in appearance to the hybrids, they produced fertile offspring. The evolutionary process had created a separate species that could reproduce but not mate with the goat's beard plant from which it had evolved. That is one example of new information having been gained. And let's see, Dr. Robert Carter, who is in fact actually a creationist, and he wrote in this article in What is that? That is the Journal of Creation, and it said, "Can mutations create new information?" Now, Dr. Carter says many creationists claim that mutations are not able to produce new information. Yet, in a packed genome operating in at least 4 dimensions and packed with meta information, potential changes are strongly prescribed. Can mutations produce new information? Yes. The phrase that mutations cannot produce new information is almost a mantra among some creationists, yet I do not agree. Now, what he argues is that God actually encoded all of these mutations into us, but they are, in fact, new, being released at some time. But I found that argument a rather interesting one. And one of the ways in which we add new information is polyplodity. I'm sorry, I probably pronounced that incorrectly, where, in fact, many species end up either doubling or in some ways adding to the number of genes that they have. This is how we went from single cell to larger structures. It has been observed, and it is a good example of new information being added and how smaller organisms with a smaller amount of DNA can become much larger ones. But I would start with the goat's beard, if that answers your question.
The goat's beard is a plant. It was brought in and took over in there, like we have kudzu down here, a nuisance, for most of the people in the South. And you're saying the goat's beard was able to, as it traveled west, was able to meet a new plant and produce offspring that were almost always sterile, similar to the mules that we get from horses and donkeys crossbreeding. But now all of a sudden you found one that became fertile, and it was not able to produce back with the original parent stock. It is still a plant. It would take trillions and trillions and trillions of examples like this to change from a worm to a whale or a mosquito. Now, I'd like to clarify, this article from National Geographic back in 2005, millions of years ago, dolphins, you said dolphins don't have these, dolphins had legs. If you look closely at a dolphin skeleton below, you'll see 2 small rod-shaped pelvic bones. These bones may be leftover hind legs that some scientists think mean the dolphin's ancestors walked around on land. They say dolphins' ancestors look like wolves, but were more closely related to modern-day cows. So the dolphins do have it. I cannot verify if all types of whales had it, but I showed the pilot whale has these bones, the humpback whale has them, the killer whale has them.
If I can interrupt just for one, I apologize for interrupting. What I meant was doesn't have that muscle structure. They have the bones, and I believe I had said, unless I misspoke, I believe I had said that dolphins, porpoises, and whales all have the bones, but the muscle structure for reproduction exists only in large whales. So the dolphins do not have that muscle structure.
I would question that, and I'll have to have that proven to me. Why would they have these bones for no function? That would be an irritant, not a blessing. And I suspect a person whose dolphin anatomy knowledge is high would say, oh, yes, they do have muscles, and they use them as frequently as they can, as she will let them. So that's, I would have to have that proven to me.
Well, that's why the doctor from the Oceanographic Institute he's ready. He's ready to have that discussion, and I think I gave it, but we could.
You mentioned polyploidy. That is simply a doubling of the exact same chromosome. This is not new information. It's a doubling of existing information. If I give you a peanut butter and jelly sandwich, or if I give you 50 peanut butter and jelly sandwiches, you still have a peanut butter and jelly sandwich. Polyploidy, like the giant strawberries you see now in the store that taste terrible, that is polyploidy. It's a doubling of the chromosomes. It's not any new information. It's if you think of the chromosomes as a book with all the letters of the alphabet arranged in a particular order to make sentences that make sense in English. What if I give you a book and say, oh no, I'm going to give you 2 identical books? It's the same thing, repeated. The DNA code is similar to the letters of the alphabet, able to write, with our 26 letters, you can arrange them in certain orders and make millions of words and an infinite number of sentences. But you're never going to turn it into Chinese with our 26 letters of the alphabet, or Hindi or any other language. So I think that polyploidy is not an example of gaining information. It's a doubling of existing information. And I'd have to see, again, the whales or the dolphins or whatever is losing information. So if that's the best you've got of gaining the wildflower that can now no longer interbreed with its parents, I don't know why. Maybe I'll study that one, the goat's beard. Thank you. Appreciate that. but it's still a flower, it's still a plant. This is not gaining new information. If the mules, 1 out of 20,000 mules is fertile. Generally, horse and a jackass breed and get a mule which is sterile. 19,999 of them are sterile, but there have been cases where they've been able to breed. But they always produce an animal that looks like a horse. 4-wheel drive, leather upholstery, single hoof. This is not evidence that a worm could turn into a whale. I think you're desperate to believe that theory, and I don't know why, Nick, when you want to believe such a thing, but I mean, you're welcome to believe what you want, but that you haven't given any evidence of any animal gaining anything that really new information. Go ahead.
All right. Well, thank you. I think once again to reiterate, and I'm glad we established this at the beginning, but we seem to be losing ground on this one. The one claim that flower will always, all its descendants will always be flowers. All the descendants of any worm will always be worms. They will always, any descendant of a human being will always be a human being, no matter how much evolution there is. And if there's miscommunication on that point, that is one of the most basic, fundamental concepts that exists in evolution. And if that's one that's not understood, I think there's a problem. Nobody claims it will ever become a different kind. So I am not suggesting that that flower is going to become anything other than a flower. Now, there is another interesting one. So, and the polyploidy, what happens is when you double that, you are correct to the best of my understanding, which is that it is a duplicate of what exists, but that doubles the chance of a mutation happening and that mutation producing something. In many cases, the mutation is negative and it gets selected out. In some cases, it's positive. Now, this is an article from New Scientist magazine by Bob Holmes, and this was a discovery of something very interesting. Bacteria make a major evolutionary shift in the lab. Now, the way we knew to look for this is because we understand how evolution works. And what happened here, this is absolutely a gaining of new information. A major evolutionary innovation has unfurled right in front of researchers' eyes. It is the first time evolution has ever been caught in the act of making such a rare and complex new trait. They took E. coli, and around the 31,000th generation, something dramatic happened. The bacteria suddenly acquired the ability to metabolize citrate, a second nutrient in their culture that E. coli normally cannot use. Now, I'm going to suggest two things. First of all, this is absolutely the acquiring of a new trait. But second of all, it actually still is E. coli. It's just and they had to name it as a subset of E. coli. It is just the next evolved. It hasn't turned into a new species and never will. But it has acquired this new trait, and this is the let's see, an evoltionary biologist, Jerry Coyne, said the thing I like most about this is that let's see, anti-evolutionists say you cannot get these complex traits by a combination of unlikely events. He says this is exactly what has happened here, and creationists say cannot happen. This is absolutely an example of very simple E. coli bacteria that has never been able to metabolize this, learning to metabolize this nutrient.
Okay. Well, you said something interesting. You said, I got your quote right, I was trying to, descendants of worms will always be worms. So descendants of Protista will always be Protista. Why do they show the descendants of the Protista to be everything? Here they have, we're teaching the kids, the descendants of Protista are humans. But you said the descendants of worms will always be worms. They can't get outside of their clade, whatever a clade is. So how did the Protista get outside? How did the Protista produce something that's no longer a Protista? Apparently it did, according to the charts. I mean, with thousands of millions of these charts on the internet. I got 200 textbooks over here that all have these charts in them. So I think it's an inconsistent position, Nick. You're saying they will always stay in, you're always going to be in the Abraham's family or something like that. And I would agree. And I would say Protista have always produced Protista. Why do we make the kids learn a chart that says Protista became humans and zebras and dinosaurs and sharks?
Well, if you can leave that up for a second, I think that's a perfect example of what I'm talking about because, and this is why in the opening I discussed this. I'm sorry, did I cut you off? I don't want to.
Go
ahead. The reason we use a family tree exactly like this is so that you can go back to lineage and figure out what is still a kind of what. So human beings are still a kind of ape. We will never not be a kind of ape. Everything that we give birth to will be a kind of ape and a kind of human being. Everything that ape that ape was a kind of mammal, so we are a kind of mammal. So if you look at that tree, you can add up. We are a kind of all of the things on that tree. I do think there's one or two errors on that tree. We are not descended from fish, and I have actually seen that one, and that one has an error just because it's too compact. But at any rate, we are a kind of eukaryote. It all started with eukaryotes. Oh, there you go, the first cells. That works perfectly. So human beings are a kind of mammal, are a kind of animal, or a kind of eukaryote, and so on and so forth. And the reason that tree is so useful is in the exact same way that you can add up all the descendants of a family, you can add up everybody on the family tree. But we are absolutely a kind of mammal. And I think there isn't anybody, everybody knows that we're a mammal, and that's, I don't think any biologist has ever said we are not. We did not change kinds. Our descendants did not change kinds. They added kinds in the same way that people can get married and add new members to their family. Now, I think there was something else you had said that I haven't addressed, but I probably spaced it. We were talking E. coli. Okay, so those kinds of changes, you're always still going to, and if we evolve into something else, our ancestors will still be humans, and that's something else.
Okay,
so yes.
Is a protozoa a mammal? Does it have mammary glands?
No, and if you look, that's why it is not on that part in the tree.
So a single-celled protozoa, which is, are we single-celled? Are we the protozoa is not a mammal. The protozoa did become something else somewhere along the line. This is what the kids are being taught. This is my objection. I don't care if you guys want to believe all this stuff. It doesn't bother me. But you want to force everybody to pay for this silliness to be taught to all the kids. And it's not, which is the purpose of this debate. It is not true. It cannot be observed or tested or demonstrated that a protozoa has ever produced anything besides a protozoa. And you said, well, of course, they always will. Well, apparently they didn't in the past. How come from here on in the future it can't happen, but in the past you believe it did happen? This is not science, Nick. This is fairy tale, SpongeBob imagination stuff. It happened long ago and far away. Well, make it happen today. Get a bunch of protozoa and make it happen again. I want to see it this time.
All right, two quick responses to that. First of all, again, if you can read that tree properly, I think what you will find is that again, the claim isn't that these have become something new, but that they have added to what they are and refined into something different, but maintain everything that they were previously. If you would like an example of that, I do have this. Scientists have witnessed, and this happened February 20th, 2019. This is brand new. This is probably the single, this is utterly staggering. Scientists have witnessed a single-celled algae evolve into a multicellular organism. The evolution took just 50 weeks. It was triggered by the introduction of a single predator. The way they knew to introduce that predator and that would be effective in this was because they understood evolution, and it did exactly what it was predicted to do. The team captured 9 14-second time-lapse videos of the transition where a single-cell organism did the single most incredible evolutionary thing it can. It became a multi-celled organism. That's the ball game. That's evolution. That is absolutely the adding of new material. Incredibly, they watched as it took, okay, here we show that de novo origins of simple multicellularity can evolve in response to predation. Excuse me, I'm dyslexic as all get out. Not only that, but the resulting multicellular organisms were all incredibly varied, just as you'd expect in natural selection. The research is published in scientific reports. The paper is freely available. This is actually the paper on it. But that's the ball game. That's the hardest part in evolution, is going from a single-celled organism to a multi-celled organism. That covers all your requirements of having new information. And again, it is still as an ancestor, just as all of Jesus was an ancestor of Abraham, but not all ancestors of Abraham are actually ancestors of Jesus, because there are those in between. You still have the tree of life that functions that way, but what you have here is the single biggest evolutionary step that can be made. It was reproduced February 20th, 2019, and I believe that hits all the criteria you have listed thus far.
Okay, well, a couple of obvious questions. if now for the first time they've seen this in 2019, why have we been teaching this for 150 years with no evidence? If there was no evidence until February 20th of 2019, why were we teaching it for the last 150 years? Because it wasn't science. I don't think it's science now. I think what they've actually observed is colonization. A group of them decided to work together. If a group of people decide to work together to repel a common enemy, they build a fort and everybody get in the fort, and one guy says, I'll take care of the cannon. Somebody else says, I'll take care of the sniper rifle or whatever. That's colonization for predation, which is what you talk about. I will read the report and I'll do a critique on it if you'd like. But I think you need to stop and think. If they just now, this year, February 2019, found the best evidence ever for evolution, you got a problem. Because you've been teaching this for 150 years with no evidence, which is what I've been saying. And I don't think this is evidence either. I think this will get disproven. But I think you just shot yourself in the foot, Nick.
Well, I think my wife would agree with you that I frequently am either shooting myself in the foot or putting the foot in the mouth. But having said that, as to evidence, this actually appears to be a bit of a straw man, and here's why. You seem to be suggesting that there are two states. It's either proven or there is no evidence whatsoever. We have had staggering evidence for evolution. I've covered some of it in this already, but just staggering amounts of evidence for evolution. What's interesting about this is one of the missing pieces. And I talked about missing pieces before, and there's missing pieces in everything. There's missing pieces in the Bible, and every now and then somebody finds something new about the Bible. We find the Dead Sea Scrolls. When the Dead Sea Scrolls were found, nobody said, oh my God, there was no evidence for the Bible and now it's proven. It's not a binary state that way. And it appears to me that you're doing is you're saying, okay, well, so now you found this huge proof, and until then there was no evidence. One of the ways they found this proof is they knew what they were doing. They knew how to look for it, and they knew how to create it. And it was specifically the introduction of a predator. And I would like to point out that this is actually not colonization. They make very clear here that it is a single-celled organism that becomes multicellular, and you can see the pictures of it, and you can see how it does this, but it is its own organism. You cannot separate those cells without killing it. And again, when I say that that's the ball game, in my mind, that seems to cover every objection that, now, I will grant one thing. This does not prove common ancestor. Doesn't do it. I think that's already been demonstrated and proven. That doesn't do it. It does prove one thing. Evolution, the way it's been described, is absolutely possible. We have now seen it, and we have reproduced it, and we did so deliberately. We said, we're going to try to reproduce it, and in 50,000 iterations of E. coli, we succeeded. So the fact that science was able to make these predictions and we were able to produce it suggests to me that we know exactly what we're doing. But at any rate, it takes off the table that this can't be true, and at a minimum puts on, we now know we can evolve. So the question is, we've got all this evidence that we did evolve. We were able to use that evidence to make this prediction and actually evolve a species ourselves in real time. It seems to me to be very difficult to say that this isn't true.
Okay, question. Did they give this new creature a name? Does this have the name of the thing? I'll look it up.
I think they did. It was an E. coli something. No, the E. coli was the one that gained the new. That was one shift. I don't know what the name of this thing is. It's probably on here somewhere, and I've got the full paper. Like I said, the paper is, and I can get you the name of the paper. It's Matthew Heron, Joshua Browen, Johnny. The other thing I can do is put it up onto a freeze frame. Or I can put it up here so people can freeze frame it. I got most of it here. I'm not going to waste everyone's time by looking at it, but anyone can freeze frame it there. And like I said, I'll put a copy up. They've made this publicly available to. Okay, yeah, it's Chloriella vulgaris. I have no idea. You're going to make me read Latin, aren't you? You are. Oh my God! Yeah, I told you I'm dyslexic, and you said, Nick, read the Latin for me.
Yeah, Latin's a dead language. It killed the Romans, and now it's killing us.
It's killing me.
I have a question, though, Nick. Is this multicellular creature able to reproduce with another multicellular creature, or do they always have to start from scratch with single cells getting together? If so, that would seem more like a colony. If it's actually a new creature, it should be able to reproduce with another one similar to it I think they're grossly over-exaggerating out of desperation. I doubt that this thing's able to take in food and give off waste. The functions of an organism have been well defined in biology for centuries. Be able to grow, reproduce, take in and digest their food, whatever that is, and give off a waste product. Does this thing actually meet the criteria, or is this just some scientist who's desperate to prove his theory so that he can justify rejecting the scriptures? Is my take on it. So see if you can find out, was this thing capable of reproducing with another one similar to it, or did it have to start from scratch every time to build a new one?
No, it can, and in fact, they've had numerous iterations and life cycles of it, and the new one can reproduce. Now, the other thing, and to get back to go against Scripture, you have to keep in mind a great many of people who have believed in evolution have also, first of all, believed in Scripture. Catholics, it's the official position of the Catholic Church that evolution and the Big Bang are correct. That if that's the official position of the Catholic Church, I don't think they've got anything against Scripture. And Darwin had nothing against Scripture. That was not the answer he wanted. This was directly, he despised this. It caused a major a crisis of faith. I don't think, first of all, that they're necessarily in conflict, but I don't think that anyone in science is out to destroy anything. But this is a fully functioning, and they have to, I forget what they used to keep it alive, but they grew it in a petri dish. It had the full nutrients. It strains within each life cycle. Let's see. Well, if you really want me to find it, I could probably, I think it's going to take some time, but it is a full functioning organism. And in fact, also the other thing, just in case people are interested, this is in the paper, but you can actually see how it becomes a multi-celled organism. And it is an organism by the scientific definition. So again, in my mind, that absolutely does not prove common ancestry. Doesn't do that. I think that's proved by other means. But what this does prove is that evolution is absolutely a viable theory, and when you combine it with everything else, I think it's pretty well understood what evolution says and means.
Well, they have to keep it alive. That's interesting. If this happened in nature, you get a totally new group of cells get together and form an organism. Now you have a host of other problems with fitting into it a whole ecology. It has to have not only someone to mate with of the opposite sex somehow. And how do you tell with a group of cells? I don't know. But we don't want to go down that road. It has to have a whole ecology, an environment to live in. Would it be simply eaten by something else that's already there? Say, oh no, new food. Let's eat this thing, and they're gone. To claim that this could happen trillions and trillions of times over billions of years, to change from an amoeba or a protista to a biology teacher is, I think, a great leap of faith. The official position of the Catholic Church, I could care less what the Catholic. I'll debate the Pope any day of the week on several topics. How do you get saved? Got to pay them money to go to heaven? There's two kinds of religions, Cain and Abel. Cain thought, I can please God with my works. Here, God, here's my fruit, my vegetables. Look what I did for you. Didn't work for Cain. Read Genesis 4. Abel brought an innocent sacrifice. The Catholics are just another branch of the Cain religion, trying very hard to please God by their works. They make great neighbors. If they're really honest, true Catholics, they won't steal from you. That's great, but that's not going to get them into heaven. So I think that I don't care what they believe. I'll debate the Pope on evolution. Give him a call. Tell him, Kent Hovind, Lenox, Alabama. Come on down. I'll give him a tour on the Kawasaki Mule. Instead of the Pope mobile, put a glass over the top.
Well, I that makes a lot of sense, but I will point out, so the Catholic Encyclopedia lists 55,000 denominations of Christianity. Now, that's an unfair characterization because they say any denomination is a church that doesn't necessarily, so you could have a Catholic denomination, but they're not sending their money to the Catholic Church, so they count as a different denomination. There's actually 3,000 mutually excommunicative sects of Christianity. These are sects that say ours is the one path to salvation, and if you don't follow ours, so that's 3,000 excommunicative sects, and I have yet to find any way one of them can say that theirs is in fact the correct one. And if there was an easy answer to that, I don't think there would be 3,000. So it sounds like no true Scotsman. You're not a Christian unless you follow my version of Christianity. And that may be true, that may not. My overall point here is that there have been many Christians, and in fact, actually, if you take a look at the religion of Nobel Prize winners between 1990 and 2000, 65% of them have been Christian. Now, have they been Christian in the sense that you mean? I'm not entirely sure. And I think that's something that maybe everybody has to struggle with when it comes to their own religion. But I don't think, I think the vast majority of people seem to think that these are not incompatible, these beliefs. And the evidence for it is extraordinary. And we still haven't gotten to, I think we can get to, I don't know how we are on time, but I think we can get to, I mean, there's fossils, there's other evidence for how and why we know how human beings evolved. There's the DNA, there is all sorts of stuff. But I think, so I seem to have lost the train where we were.
Yeah, well, let me respond to one thing you said. 55,000 denominations and 3,000 who believe it's our way or no way. I'm certainly not one of those. I think salvation is only by grace through faith. But after all the arguments of all the centuries are all over and done, and you're going to die one day, Nick, and so am I.
Yeah.
Are you going to heaven? If you died today, are you going to heaven? Do you know for sure you're going to heaven?
No. I don't know for sure. So I'm not trying to say, no, I'm not going to go to heaven. I don't know for sure.
Okay. I am sure, not because I'm good, but because I'm forgiven. 50 years ago, I said, Lord, I'm a sinner. Would you please forgive me? And his blood was applied to my account. And I've got his righteousness on my account. Can't lose. I'm going to heaven for sure. And I think you can have the same thing. That's probably step one, is for you to get the Lord in your heart and get saved. And then he will enlighten you to say, wow, the Bible is true. Would you agree that the Bible teaches that God made everything in 6 days? It's in the 10 Commandments. He said, honor the Sabbath, Exodus 20:11, because in 6 days the Lord made heaven and earth, the sea and all that in them is. Do you believe the Lord made everything in 6 literal days?
Two answers. First of all, you said you're saved. Not according to Southern Baptists, who, unless you are doing the sinner's prayer quite regularly, you're not saved. So I still think there's a number of denominations that would disagree with you, and they will go to their graves believing every bit as strongly that they are correct and you are incorrect. As to what the Bible teaches, I think that the Bible does, I mean, the Bible says it's 6 days. Whether it's 6 literal days or not is sort of above my pay grade. But there are people who certainly believe that, and there are people who believe that the 6 days is metaphorical, or that the 6 days are 6 days in heaven, which is measured quite differently than 6 days on earth. And I think you get into biblical hermeneutics, and it becomes very difficult to understand precisely what is meant by that.
Well, we see from Genesis chapter 1 and 2, God made the plants on day 3 and the sun on day 4, and the animals to pollinate the plants on day 5. So I think it'd be really tough to say they're not literal days. Then plants are going to die waiting for the sun to come up and something to pollinate them. So I think the obvious teaching when God said, Moses, tell the people to work 6 days and rest 1, because I worked 6 days and rested 1. He's not telling them to work 6 million years and rest 1 million. He's telling them 6 days. Jesus said,
if I can ask a quick question, the flood, Noah's Ark, was subjected to, if it's going to cover the whole earth, was subjected to 6 inches of rain a minute. There is no structure that can withstand that kind of rain. So either one of two things in my mind happened. Either in somehow God interceded so that this boat was able to stay afloat, which strikes me to make some sense. But if that's the case, then certainly God could keep the plants alive without the sun. And I'm not sure that he's necessarily bound to, again, missing information. Just because the Bible doesn't say that he wasn't keeping the plants alive, it's God. I think the people who, and again, I'm not religious, so I'm speaking for people who are not my clan, but I think there are plenty of people who believe that God could intercede in such a way that the plants would be just fine for 1 million years.
Okay, I'd like to see how they metabolize. As far as 6 inches of rain per minute, I think you're laboring under a false illusion here that all the water for the flood came from rain. The Bible says it rained for 40 days, but the water kept coming up for 150 days. If you read Genesis 6 carefully, it says the fountains of the great deep broke open. Nearly all of the water for the flood came from inside the earth, not from above. The fountains of the deep broke open, and then the windows of heaven were open. So the rain was 40 days, probably only added a couple of feet of water, whereas the fountains of the deep, if the Bible teaches very clearly in Psalm 24 and Psalm 33 and Psalm 136, 3 witnesses, that there was water in the crust of the earth. There still is today, enormous amounts of water in the crust of the earth. You can drill about anywhere and get a well if you go deep enough, but there are huge subterranean pockets of water. A Japanese scientist did a study on this and said probably 10 oceans worth of water in the crust of the earth right now, still. But if the water was in the crust of the earth, say 10 miles down, if that water broke through and came to the surface then would sink in to fill the void, which is probably why the earth sped up just a little bit. We now have 365.2422 days instead of 360. But the water for the flood came from inside. Plus, the assumption 6 inches per minute is based on you have to cover Mount Everest. Well, Mount Everest was probably not there. The mountains arose, at Psalm 104 teaches, toward the end of the flood, the mountains arose, the valleys sank down. An earth covered with water, cracked up into plates, the San Andreas Fault, the Hayward Fault, the New Madrid Fault, probably all of them formed where the water burst forth from the pockets, from the fountains of the deep. The plates of the earth would be shifting and tilting, and if one section of the earth dips down 2 miles and something else lifts up 2 miles on a 1,000-mile plate, 2 miles is nothing out of 1,000, you now have a mountain range and an ocean. All the water is going to run down into the ocean. Not on screen. Oh. So if you have the plate of the earth, 1,000 miles, let's say, the size of Texas, if it covered with a mile of water, if it tilts a little bit, the water's going to rush down. And you have, it's interesting, if you look at any globe or map of the world, all the mountain ranges follow the coastlines. Appalachian Mountains follow the Atlantic. The Rocky Mountains follow the Pacific. The Andes Mountains follow the South Pacific. The Alps follow the Mediterranean. It's as if they form the oceans and the mountain ranges at the same time because of the same thing. So you need to watch my video number 6. If you don't have that, Nick, let me know and I'll send an address and I'll send you my seminar series. You can watch it. And I think we get you straight theology about the flood. It did not have to rain 6 inches a minute. The flood water came from inside, water coming up, not down. Okay, go ahead.
Well, I think that's perfect. That's marvelous. I would absolutely love to learn about it. Now, one of the things is, so this is well beyond my level of expertise. Now, when I want to talk about the Bible, so there's a Bible passage that I've always found interesting. Eliseus was traveling to Bethel, and he went up thence to Bethel and was going upon his way. Little boys came out of the city to mock him, saying, "Go up, thou bald head, go up, thou bald head." Now, that is 4 Kings 2:23 and 24. Now, if you talk to an atheist, well, so what happens to those boys? 2 Bears goes and kills 42 boys for mocking this old guy. Now, if you talk to an atheist, they're going to sit there and say, "Oh, look how terrible God is," so on and so forth. If you talk to somebody who knows the Bible, who's religious, and when I have religious questions, I don't go to my atheist friends when I have questions about the Bible, because I go to a minister, and I've got a couple ministers, Greek Orthodox, American Baptist, who are friends of mine who will answer questions when I have them. One of the answers to this is, and I asked about this, and I asked a minister, because every atheist I spoke to said, "Isn't it terrible that God tore apart 42 kids for this?" And what the truth is when you understand what "go up, thou bald head, go up," that is a threat. They are threatening to kill him. And if I remember correctly, it's been a while since I've looked at this, but if I remember correctly, he was a prophet. So these children are threatening to murder a prophet. That is only something you could know if you talk to somebody who studied the Bible and who believes it. And once it's done in that set of criteria, all of a sudden you can understand the Bible much better. And again, you don't have to believe it, but now it doesn't look as terrible as it does. So when you talk about the flood and you say these are things I didn't know. So you've taught me something new, and I think it's valuable. But to bring this back to evolution, this is precisely why I think people need to talk about. We get into the whale hip bones, which we've discussed. Any biologist will tell you that in the females, again, it varies on species, but the bones are there, and especially for the smaller species, it's not connected to anything. And you had said repeatedly, why would it be there if it's not connected to anything? Precisely, that's the point. And if you look in the DNA actually tells you why it's there and where they came from. And again, it's a second tree of life that we already got essentially from the fossil record. Now, there's an interesting thing, because I know a number of creationists have said this, where the fossil record is circular in some way or another. But again, that is a serious misunderstanding because, okay, in some cases they do use fossils to date other fossils in the layers, and in some cases they date them by a different means. But the question is, how can you, if you're going to date fossils with other fossils, you're creating a circular system. This strikes me as very similar to the problem of Jesus and Daniel. If someone comes up and says, hey, look, how do I know that Jesus was the Messiah? Well, there are many ways to do it, but let's say I decide to say Daniel. Daniel predicted Jesus, and he predicted when Jesus was going to be crucified, down to the year, which more than 600 years away. He predicted this. Okay, well, how do we know that he's right, that this was Jesus? Well, we know because Jesus died. Well, how do we know that Jesus was the Messiah? Well, because Daniel predicted it. And you end up with a completely circular system. Now, people use this to discredit the Bible all the time, but the problem is, if you look at Daniel, you'll see he made other predictions. This isn't the only one. And if you look at the New Testament, you'll find Jesus performed miracles that Daniel got him down to the year isn't the only evidence of him being the Messiah. But if you want to straw man the Bible, the best way to do it and to say, well, it's self-fulfilling, is Daniel and Jesus. But you have to ignore all the other evidence. Are there fossils that are used to date other fossils in a way that might appear circular? Yes, but what you need to do is not talk to someone who doesn't believe it, not talk to someone who, and again, if we look at the whales, it seems to me that if you think evolution isn't true, you find that study that says in the males, in a certain species of the males, these bones have that purpose, and you sit there and say, poof, done, it's all answered. But all you got to do is scratch below it and realize, no, the study doesn't say what you think it does. And if you read that study, they say, look, in the males that have that hip bone, the hip bone has not atrophied as quickly as the others, as exactly evolution would predict. And while I agree that evolution is adding new information, it absolutely is, it also is accounting for what happens to the old information over time. And it has happened in those whales exactly as Darwin predicted.
All right, a couple of quick thoughts, Steve. Put me back on here. Let's cover the story about the 42.
If I can interrupt real quick, because I do want to get this. But how much time do we have left, just so I can do either for pacing or just because? Do we have a set clock or?
No, it's been an hour and a half. Let's go about 10 more minutes, and you can have the final word. Well, you started, so you give your closing, and I'll give mine.
Sounds perfect.
Here's the story. 2 Kings chapter 2. Something's on screen there. Okay. 2 Kings chapter 2. And he went up from thence unto Bethel, and as he was going up by the way, there came forth little children out of the city, and mocked him, and said unto him, Go up, thou bald head, go up, thou bald head. And he turned back and looked on them, and cursed them in the name of the Lord. And there came forth 2 she-bears out of the wood, and tare 42 children of them. So it does not say it killed them. It says it tore them.
That's a good point.
Tore them up. Didn't kill them. It might have killed them, but it doesn't say that. You got to be careful when you're going to, if some of the skeptics want to attack the Bible, they tend to exaggerate their enemy to make it look worse. The Bible does not say that. You mentioned
That's
Daniel.
why I got to talk to people like you about the Bible, because you know 10 times more. But this is, that's a really good point.
Okay. Just like it doesn't say all the flood water came from rain. It doesn't say that. So that's a straw man argument to say 6 inches an hour. That's what the atheists do. As far as Daniel predicting Christ, and you claim that was a circular argument, that is not correct. Daniel predicted in the future. That doesn't mean when Christ was born, we can now go back and write the book of Daniel 600 years earlier. Daniel was already written and sealed. So it's a linear argument. It's not circular. To find fossils, and there's no fossil record, first of all. There are lots of fossils. I've got thousands here in our museum. But it's not a record. None of the fossils you find, none of them have dates on them. None of them have a timestamp. They just simply are a fossil in the dirt. And none of them talk. So there is no fossil record, Nick. It's a bunch of fossils, and somebody's putting their interpretation on them. And I think they're mistaken. Science has a long history of teaching things that are wrong, and they have a long history of not being willing to change once it's been proven they're wrong. They taught for 2,000 years that big rocks fall faster than little rocks. It's not true, but that's what they taught, because Aristotle said it. Oh, it must be true. And I think we're doing that today. Well, Darwin said it. Oh, it must be true. Yes. It's just simply not true. Nobody's ever observed any animal produce a different kind of animal. And yet the textbooks are showing the kids, look, protistas slowly turn to biology teachers. I resent paying for that. There's no possible way any fossil could show that happening. No animal today produces anything other than its kind. So why could the fossils do it? It's just not common sense. I think we've covered, well, I got a whole list of things from the first half hour, but there is no such thing as a tree of life. This is non-existent. Each one of these is a bunch of bushes. All the mollusks produce mollusks. That doesn't prove they have connections with worms and flatworms and jellyfish and protista and fish and humans. These lines are imagination. Each one is a separate tree. I think there's a tree of life of butterflies, and there are probably quite a variety of butterflies came from a common ancestor called a butterfly. There are 7,500 varieties of apple trees in the world recognized by biologists. They might have had a common ancestor called an apple tree. So certainly wild variations happen. From Great Dane to Chihuahua, wild variations happen. Most of the variations we have in modern husbandry wouldn't survive on their own in nature. They're, have to be protected and babysit by somebody, to keep it alive, like the Chihuahua. They would never last in the woods more than 20 minutes. The one around here is lucky. She's still alive. With the hawks flying by. But so this is imagination to say that because we see 1,000 varieties of butterflies, therefore we can deduce that butterflies and turtles and frogs and fish are related. This is imagination. This is not science. So the topic of the debate was, is the theory of evolution true? I say, no. Variations within the kind certainly happens. Microevolution, I hate to use that word because it does give the credence to the word evolution, but it's a variation within the same kind, and it does not add up to macroevolution. You can believe that if you'd like, but that's not science. And the vast majority of Christians accepting this, that is sad. That proves I have job security. So tell them all, I'll debate them all at the same time. Go ahead.
Well, thank you. So I agree with you that keeping it alive in a petri dish is very different than keeping it alive in the environment. That is precisely why 99% of all the species ever to have lived on the earth has gotten wiped out. And it is that process and that difficulty that actually causes evolution to work. It wouldn't work without that difficulty. I agree with you. Daniel is not circular. That was actually the point of my argument. Daniel is not circular. Daniel is strawmanned as circular by atheists. And when you understand that there's other evidence in Daniel, and when you understand that Daniel was written and accepted before Jesus was even born, it can't possibly be circular. But the argument can be made to look circular, which was the point I was trying to make. And I think that is exactly what happens when people take a look at the fossil record and say it's circular. They're doing actually the exact same thing. I agree it's not circular, and that was actually really the point of my argument. As to the fossil records, there is a fossil record. There is no one, it's not in any one place, and the fossils are in fact time-stamped. They're time-stamped by a number of different dating methods, and these dating methods can work in confluence and have been able to demonstrate time and time again anywhere in the world that they are reliable. And now the column of there's multiple columns of strata of fossils, and these columns, well, there is no one complete one, and we wouldn't expect a complete one. You get closer to complete ones in areas of geological stability, areas where there aren't earthquakes and stuff like that, where there haven't been serious floods. You can get a very nice column, but that column overlaps and is reproduced in different places all across the world. And what we get from all of them, because they overlap and because they are confluent, this ends up allowing, what was I going to say? This is how we know that the record is reliable. Now, I suspect what we're going to get is some information on possible difficulties with carbon dating, and that is another topic. We're running out of time, but maybe we do this again. I certainly enjoyed it, and we can get into carbon dating and the fossil record, but it is a record, and in fact, the record was started by now I forget the name of the person who first discovered most of these discovered the actual fossil record, but it was discovered before Darwin. Darwin used it as part of how he built his theory, but it was discovered by mostly theists, people who were Christians and who already believed. The dating, there are some issues with, so the shells, I see that. Yeah, we can discuss the dating, but I should try to wrap it up.
Sure.
I think I covered most of the stuff. Please.
Okay, we'll do this again sometime. So I'd like to ask you a simple question. The geologic column, James Hutton and some others invented all this back in 1830s. They say that the bottom layer is older than the top layer.
Yes.
And you can date the fossils by which layer they come from. So if it comes from a bottom layer, it's got a date that's older than from the top layer. If the top layer is indeed younger than the bottom layer, where did this layer come from? Did it come from outer space? Is material being added to the Earth? Nick, all of the dirt on the planet is the same age. All of it. Even if it came by evolution, by their theory, a rock cooled down from the Big Bang of the Earth was a molten rock, and it cooled down and developed a hard rocky crust. It was liquid and became solid, and then gradually oceans formed, and it melted the sediments and turned them into mud and soil. Everything is the same age. Is this layer on top coming from outer space? How could they think it's millions of years younger? I don't think they've ever thought of that. And we can go through bad dates. We have plenty of those, but go ahead.
Like I said, when somebody finds a defeater to the Bible and they say, oh, I just found proof that the Bible is false if you read it. I found a contradiction. Listen, people have been studying the Bible for 2,000 years. If you think you found a contradiction just by reading it in 5 minutes, you're probably underestimating, or you're overestimating yourself. I would argue, in fact, that's the sin of pride. Let's take a look at the ocean. Is the best place actually to find fossils, because what happens is when things die, they settle down at the bottom of the ocean. Sediment ends up covering it, and that is how the fossils are preserved, and you end up getting layer after layer after layer. There is constant debris, dust, all sorts of matter all around us, and that matter is settling. It's also getting kicked back up again in various places. That's why you have a hard time having a stable, consistent column, is because it can get kicked up or moved around by any sorts of ways. But in the ocean in particular, what happens is you have sedimentary layers that are constantly getting added to that, and that buries the newer layers on top of the older layers.
All right, well, we should continue this another time, or you come down and visit Pensacola, Florida. I'll give you, not Pensacola, where am I at? Lenox, Alabama. I was in Pensacola for 30 years. Get stuck in the brain here. Fossils, are fossils forming today in any significant numbers, Nick? I think if you Google fossil graveyard, you'll find there are examples where there are trillions of fossils in one location. Many times all the bones are fully articulated. They're still connected to each other, full skeletons. Had to be buried quickly in water or mud or both. And how many animals died today, and how many are going to turn to fossils? My contention is, I think you'd have a hard time finding any fossils forming today, any, let alone trillions that have been found. I think the best explanation for this is a rapid flood, like the Bible teaches. But like it says in 2 Peter, the scoffers in the last days are ignorant of the creation and the flood. A global flood, which is certainly what Jesus believed in. He preached about Noah. He believed in Noah. He believed the story of Genesis. He quoted Genesis 25 times. So your position is certainly calling Jesus a liar, which you're welcome to do, but I think you need to realize what you're doing. The flood is the best explanation for all the fossils. And I got a dozen pictures on my video number 4 of petrified trees, standing up petrified, connecting a whole bunch of these layers. Sometimes the trees are upside down, connecting all the layers. A flood is the only way to explain that I can think of, unless the tree grew upside down for millions of years looking for sunlight. So we'll get into that another time. But thank you so much for doing this. You want to give any contact info? You want to give your contact info if people want to get a hold of you?
Nicholas Lamar Soutter. I can be found just under Nick Soutter on Twitter. I can be found. I have a website, Nicholas Lamar Soutter, and also I'm the owner and operator of the Humanist Codex, and I own the Nicholas Lamar Soutter YouTube channel.
Good. And if you want to get hold of me, drdino.com, DRDINO, or come visit Lenox, Alabama, population 35. We're so far out in the country, they got to pump in the sunshine. Now, the moonshine flows freely in this county, but sunshine, they got to pump that in. So Nick, thanks for doing this. Appreciate that. We'll do it again sometime, okay?
Thank you for hosting me. I sincerely appreciate it. I enjoyed it very much.
Thank you. All right, folks, this is Kent Hovind at Dinosaur Adventureland in Lenox, Alabama. We will not have Bible study tonight. We did last night a Q&A time for the people that are working here. I think everybody enjoyed that. People come and go all the time, and you guys enjoying your here a few more days, right? Yes. And your dad is actually going to paint the dinosaur on the old 1953 drag line. Okay. I'm reluctant to say we have a drag line here at DAL because somebody may misinterpret that. Say, oh, wow. Never mind. Okay. Anyway, thanks for joining us. If you want to help support our ministry, go to drdino.com and join our 777 club. We're asking folks if they can give $1 a day, $31 a month. Take us on as a missionary to the blind and the dumb. We want to help these folks. Thank you. See you tomorrow. Bye.